All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you all for taking the time and showing up for this session. And hopefully we'll give you something to walk away with that is helpful to you in your day-to-day lives. The intention here today is that we're going to talk about the juxtaposition of security and compliance and how those things go together. Oftentimes they're confused as one thing, and really there is a very important synergy between the two of them where both of them have to be taken into account when you're building your security program. So that's really the focus of the content today, as well as talking about how to implement some of the suggestions we're getting and then how to leverage some outsourced support if you're looking for it. So let's go ahead without further ado and get started. What's going on today in the world is we're seeing a huge increase in attacks, as you've seen in the keynote sessions. More and more people are getting attacked on a daily basis, and the expectations, as you'll see in a few minutes, are continuing to rise over time. The expectations, however, are getting more and more stringent that there is no tolerance for a breach. So how do we, as IT professionals, protect the environment while there's a huge rise in attacks, but no rise in corresponding budget to be able to support and block and prevent those attacks? What's going on effectively is that there's a huge cost to implementing or being attacked, and you see this cost impacted in the number of stolen records, the cost per record, and then the other factor that's important here is that its repeat breaches are a challenge. There's a 27% chance, almost a 28% chance that if you've been breached, you will get breached again. And that's pretty significant if you take into account that's more than a quarter of the time. 1 out of every 4 times somebody's going to be able to re-breach you again. And then the average cost of that breach is about $3.6 million globally. The security challenge is really articulated in the context of ransomware. That's really the biggest movement right now. And one of the biggest reasons this is on such a rise is we used to have people who were nation states or so on and so forth that were doing ransomware attacks and to collect information and then also to fund their hacking events for the information they're trying to collect for whatever nation state activities they were doing. What's come of it is, just like every other as a service, is we're starting to see ransomware as a service pop up globally, where these large-scale ransomware organizations have taken and they've created a SaaS model of their ransomware tools, capabilities, even their resources. They are becoming a call center for ransomware. And so if you're a script kiddie, rather than having to download tools and tweak them and figure out how to hack someone, you can basically subscribe and give a percentage of whatever you collect to the ransomware as a service organizations. This is the reason for such a rise in attacks that are happening. It's easier for anybody to be able to initiate an attack. And they're targeting each individual hacker, let's call them script kiddie, whatever you want to say, will be targeting different organizations for different reasons. They may be a hacktivist, they may be just trying to get some extra cash, there may be a kid who needs a new Nintendo, who knows. The reasons they do it are different for each one, and because of their reasons, their targets might be different. So what we're seeing, though, is that the cost is really, by 2021, we're expecting that the damage costs associated with cyber attacks are going to be at $6 trillion, which is significantly higher than it is today. We're still underneath $1 trillion today, but we're going rapidly higher. One of the important factors here in this conversation is that on average, it takes about 201 days to identify, to find in your logs that there's been an attack. So if it's almost a year before you realize, more than half a year before you realize something happened, now we need to go back and do forensics and figure out what it was. And the reason for that is we don't have all the right tools in place. We're doing what a lot of vendors are suggesting, which is deploy better firewalls, deploy better antivirus, deploy better malware, deploy a SIM. All of those things are important, but you have to take a defense in depth approach at your IT environment from a security perspective in order for all those things to come together and actually give you meaningful information. Because of all of the things I just said, 42% of the alerts that are popping up in a SIM, if you have one, are being ignored because of two factors. One of them is there's a lot of noise. The other one is that you're resource constrained, which you'll see 24% of organizations are reporting that they're resource constrained. We don't have someone who can sit in front of the SIM and look at the alerts as they come, so we're going to miss a lot. And then finally, those people who are sitting in front of the SIM because they're being worked due to the resource constraints so hard are getting burnt out and move on. So it creates this vicious cycle, snowball effect of we don't have enough people, our people are getting burnt out, the number of events are increasing and we keep missing events, and it just keeps becoming a bigger and bigger snowball. In context of local government and cyber attack, here's some metrics that you might find interesting. This comes from the University of Maryland, and it's basically saying that state and local governments that are feeling like they're being attacked hourly or more are 27%. So there's over a quarter of state and local governments that feel like every hour they're being attacked. Some of them have facts to back this up. Some of this is anecdotal, so take it with a grain of salt. At least once a day, almost 20% feel like they're being attacked. Less than daily, there's your other quarter. And then finally, the last 30%, they have no idea whether they're being attacked or not, and that's really from a lack of tools. The number of breaches in the I don't knows, 62%. Don't know if I've been breached or not. 30% less than daily, but the ones who do know in the hourly and at least once a day are in about the 5% point. So important factors here, tied to all the other metrics I gave you, is attacks are happening, attacks are increasing, and every day somebody is attacking. And we just saw some massive states take attacks and ransomware incidents which brought them down, Atlanta being a great example. And to prevent things like that, what we're going to talk about today. So all this was set up for what we're going to talk about today. So let's jump into some additional, sorry, I had two more slides for you before we jump into the content. So state and local governments, in order to keep up, here's some additional metrics that tell you 45% of the people are staying up at night because they're concerned about a potential security attack. On the flip side of that, what officials need to do to improve, or could use most to improve their posture, 46% need more skilled, knowledgeable information security professionals. So it's tying all back to the same stuff we've talked about up until now. Half the people can't sleep at night because they're afraid of getting attacked. Half the people need more people to solve the problem, or talent. Okay? I'm not going to read all these to you since you'll get these slides, so I won't waste your time or intelligence by doing that. But let's jump into the meat of the presentation. If we take a look at that juxtaposition I talked about, security versus compliance, these two things are very often confused as the same thing. Some people say I'm secure or I'm compliant, meaning the same thing. It's important to understand this definition for the rest of this conversation, because for us it's two different things, and they're both very important, and they both are very codependent on each other. So security is simply the state of being free from danger. That's it. We're trying to prevent something from happening. It's a risk-based approach. We're preventing risks from occurring. Compliance, on the other hand, is the act of doing what you're supposed to do. And what you're supposed to do is a rule or control that's placed on you by some body. And that body may be a regulatory body, whether it's a government or financial institutions or a industry body. Whatever the case may be, there's some body that's creating a compliance, and your task in being compliant is adhering to those rules, the controls. And the two things, as we'll talk through this presentation, come together. And I often talk about which came first, security or compliance, or which should come first. And it's the traditional chicken or egg conversation. If you take a look at these comparisons, if you look at a regulated versus a non-regulated organization, the non-regulated organization doesn't have any compliance to worry about. There's nothing other than self-imposed controls that will help them to manage their environment. And what you can see is all the things that they're measuring are around best practices and market advantages. They're trying to get ahead of the Joneses, if you will. And what that non-regulated site is really focusing on is a risk-based approach, and the success is really hard to measure. How do you measure best practices? There's no metric per se. We're doing best effort is another industry term you keep hearing. So it's very difficult to measure the success in security other than a lack of breaches. And as we're seeing, they're pretty frequent. and continuing to increase. On the regulated side, however, they are very prescriptive in the context of what they need to do, and they're also being audited on a regular basis. So somebody is inspecting that they are doing what they said they're going to do. So there's a more measurable context around the compliant or regulated side of the house. The two things come together because what compliance does for you is it gives you the baseline, the controls to monitor, but it's not enough by itself because it's a minimum. It's the minimum for that regulatory body to feel comfortable that you're doing the basics. But it doesn't protect you. It doesn't cover everything. The security side of it, that risk-based approach, is to understand the risks in your environment and then take those regulatory controls, put the two together, understand the gap analysis, and figure out where you need to go. So what I'm advocating, what we're advocating is this notion of compliance-led security, which is you need to start with compliance because you need to understand what you have to do, and then you apply the gap analysis between that and the best practices to determine what else do I need to do to better protect myself and my organization. So let's talk a little bit about what it means to build a defense in depth security landscape. So if you look starting from the bottom of this, the risk is higher as you get to the bottom of this chart, and it's reduced as you get to the top and more advanced in your security posture. The diligent organizations are the ones that implement the basics. They implement firewalls, they protect the edge, they protect the endpoints with antivirus and patch management, and they protect access to resources through authentication. So that's the bare minimum. That's the foundation level. You have to have that or you're not going to be able to say that you're secure. The next level up, where you're more hardened, you start to take more advanced solutions and putting them in place. Intrusion detection is an example. Reporting for regulatory controls so that you can see that you're actually doing what you're doing will give you visibility and a scorecard to measure your success. Add additional endpoint security, not simply antivirus and patch management, but being able to understand host-based intrusion, for example, collect information from hosts on a regular basis in logs. And then that ties into the centralized log management, pulling all your logs together in a central place so that they can be analyzed and assessed. And then vulnerability scanning on a regular basis. That gets you to the point where we're calling hardened, and you're at about a mid-level in risk. A lot of organizations will stop in that space. And the reason for that is that's giving you a comfortable sense of we've got all the right things in place. The next level up above that is being able to have a solid incident response process. What happens when a breach happens? Is that documented? Have you tried it? Have you run through the tests and pretended there was something and see what happens? Behavioral analysis. It's not enough, as you saw. I don't know how many of you were upstairs listening to the last presentation. It's not enough to have a traditional antivirus-based, signature-based security posture. It doesn't capture all these things that are coming into our network, all these creative ways and polymorphic viruses that are coming into the environment that have no signature, no identifiable signature. Behavioral analysis will help determine if something is doing what it's not supposed to do and be able to catch it. And then file integrity monitoring. How do you know if your files are being modified, whether they're being encrypted from ransomware or they're being corrupted from something else? You need to be able to understand what's going on with your files in your environment. And then finally, configuration management. If you don't have control of your configuration, how do you know if something changed it without your knowledge and then opened a port in your firewall to let something bad in? All of that comes together as your wall, if you will, your defensive posture against the outside world. There's two problems that are causing this to be a challenge from a security controls perspective. Number one, there is no edge anymore. Our users are everywhere. They sit in Starbucks and do work. They sit at home and do work. They go to client sides and do work. And so the edge is really moved outside of our organization, which makes it a little more challenging to build a wall around it. And the second thing is we're doing things like implementing SIMs, but not having resources to sit in front of those SIMs. And as you can see, this guard tower is wonderful, but there's no guard in there. So how do we know when somebody breached our wall? So it's important to have visibility and control over what's happening around your environment. what happens to your users when they're outside of your environment, and then people watching to understand all that centralized log management we implemented. What's actually happening? What behaviors are going on? What things are creating challenges for us? So all these things together come together to build a defense in depth approach. And tying back to that, it's the key to getting to that visibility, putting a guard in the guard tower, is to have a SOC. And if resources are constrained, one approach to that is to look at a managed security service provider that has a SOC as a service model that can help you do, as you see, a lot of the bullets that we talked about on that last, or a lot of bricks rather, we talked about on that last thing. So you need to be able to accomplish a lot of these basic things. You need to understand what assets in your environment. You need to be able to do vulnerability assessments on a regular basis. You need to understand when there is an attack, so intrusion detection, at not just the edge, but at your servers, at the hosts. You have to have behavioral monitoring to understand when a PC all of a sudden is connecting to a server that it never connected to before and starting to encrypt all the files. Something's wrong, something's not behaving properly. And all of that all those logs need to come together in a SIM with centralized log management, but without the 24/7 security operations. It's like the tree falling in the forest. How do you know that it fell unless you were standing right there? And that's where your SOC comes in, to make sure that you have somebody in the guard tower monitoring everything. So where do we go from here? How do we get started? It's in order to implement all of what I'm talking about, we have to take a first step. And really the first thing is understanding where you are today in context to where you want to be. We call this A delta T, your actual versus your theoretical best practice or state that you want to get to. So how do you determine, how do you get to your theoretical best process without understanding where you actually are today, and then defining the gaps and closing those gaps? So a couple of examples of how you might do that today is to do a compliance health check to understand where you are today. So whatever regulatory control or internally imposed controls that you use to monitor yourself, you implement a health check against that and see how you're doing. Am I doing all the things I'm supposed to be doing, all the things that's in our security policies and procedures? And then run vulnerability assessments. We recommend regular vulnerability assessments at least once a month, but we do for our clients once a week, which we think is a more appropriate one because patching environments change regularly for different applications. And then to get to where you're going, once you've done your baselining and understanding where you are from a compliance health check and then a vulnerability health check, if you will, then you want to go with a compliance-led strategy, which is what we're talking about. So understand whether that compliance is externally imposed on you or that compliance is internally imposed, meaning you put your own controls in place. Lead with that. Make sure that you have the basics covered. Make sure you have those controls that you say you're going to do in order to meet whatever compliance you're trying to hit. Make sure those are covered first, and then compare those to industry standards, whether we're looking at NIST or something else with the cybersecurity framework or some other best practice framework we want to apply. Then look at the gaps and see what other gaps apply to your world and which ones are cost effective to implement. All of that comes with a risk-based approach where you understand, does it make sense for me to close this risk when the risk is so small and the loss of data in that risk is going to mean nothing to the organization? Or should I be spending time on this one risk that if we lose this piece of data, we're down and out? Or if this server gets compromised, we are dead in the water. So do a risk-based approach to figuring out what you close the gaps on. And then important factor in all of what we're talking about is a defense in depth approach. So defense in depth is more than security, it is also operational. For example, if you have the ability, and I'll talk more about this, if you have the ability to detect things that are happening, that's great, but do you have the ability to recover once something happens? If you get hit with ransomware and there is not an option to pay for the key to unencrypt the data, or the organization decides they're not going to give the key once you got the money, how do you recover from that? And the operational side that comes in is the ability to recover that data that was encrypted, do a restore, and get back up and running. And do you have the proper controls in place to be able to do that, and is that tested? So defense in depth goes beyond just your security controls. It's the merge of security and operations, so SecOps and traditional tech ops, where they come together in order to get you back up and running. And then really where you can get help in the resource constraint side of the world is leveraging managed security providers. You can get a SOC as a service model for a fraction of the cost of trying to build out your own SOC and staff it for 24/7. So that's an approach to be able to solve this gap problem from a resource constraint perspective. Once you get to that point that you have determined where you are, so you've mapped the actual and you need to get to the theoretical, you can take a look at a model like this. This is a security maturity model that identifies everything on the left side as being reactive, and when you're doing the assessment of yourself, you look at this and say, are we really, a lot of organizations are really in the block and tackling stage. They're doing all the things they need to do, but they're being very reactive about it because they don't have the bandwidth, resources, or funding to be able to solve the problem. On the far right of the stage, this is an overfunded organization, in my opinion, where it's a complete risk-based approach. They've got all the multi-layer security, they're using behavioral analytics, and they're linking events across multiple devices. So in order to effectively do this, your team size will grow significantly, unless of course you use a managed security provider, where then it could be not overfunded. That middle section is that tipping point where you need to figure out, is the tipping point for me right square in the middle, or is it over to the right, or is it over to the left? And that's where that due diligence and that risk-based approach to understanding what your gaps are is going to get you. Do I need to go more risk-based approach because we have systems that are so critical to the organization that if they fail or are compromised, we're dead in the water and can't deliver services? Or are those systems well protected with the basics, and we just simply need to make sure that we have the ability to recover, moving over to the reactive side a little bit more? So that teetering point, that tipping point for where you spend your cycles, is an important factor in understanding your actuals versus your theoretical, where you want to be, and then closing that gap. So let's talk about defense in depth a little bit in more detail. So for us, defense in depth is these four areas. You need to be able to protect your environment. You need to be able to detect when something happens. You need to be able to recover after that something happens. And you need to be able to leverage encryption so that if something happens, that data is garbage to whoever took it. Analyze and manage the environment. So analyze and manage are some of the key things. The manage side is obviously operational, and that's where the operational aspects come into play. The analyze side is the important part. This is where you keep hearing today in the security space. There's things like SOAR platforms, which are orchestration and automation of responses. The key thing here is that all of those capabilities that automate require machine learning to understand what's happening and correlate data. That's the key thing. So when you look at platforms or third-party providers that you're looking at, make sure they have the ability to correlate data across all your different log sources, to combine that data into a model where they can say, this is a threat because of these factors, and here's the way you respond to this threat. So those are important things. On the detect side, a lot of us are doing the detect stuff today. On the protect side, we are implementing protect. Recover, we're doing that. But is it all tied together to give you a defense in depth model? So do your SecOps teams and your TechOps teams talk to each other, and do they meet regularly? Do they do these disaster plans if an incident happens, or incident plans, in order for you to have an incident response approach? So let's shift for a second and talk about, if you are going to go out and look for a managed security provider, how do you find one? What do you look for? So because the security is hard to measure, and I say that from the perspective that we discussed earlier, which is it's all based on best practices. So we're going to do X, Y, and Z. So how do you measure it other than we haven't had any incidents? And is that lucky? Or are we actually doing a good job? It's hard to say. It's kind of like an insurance policy, right? When you're doing security, it's like an insurance policy. We hope to God we never have an accident, but when we do, we're covered. And that's the real key, is you need to get compliance so that you have something measurable. So whatever compliance, whether internally imposed or externally imposed, you need to be able to measure something to know whether you're being successful or not. So when you pick a managed security provider, make sure it's somebody who isn't just a security player, and nor somebody who's just a compliance or an auditor. But you need to have somebody who understands both sides of that coin, because they are two sides of the same coin, and they interoperate very tightly together in order to give you a solid posture. And then really implementing that defense in depth model with a combination of internal and third-party resources is where you get across the line. The analyze and manage, very complicated and difficult to do, but that's what a traditional SOC does for you. So if you've got a good partner with a proper SOC, they're going to be doing the analyze, and the managed side of it comes back to you in the context of, here's the gaps in the environment we're seeing on a regular basis through our vulnerability tests. Here's the things you should put attention at from a risk approach. Here's the ones we think you ought to close out first. Here's the ones you can put on the back burner until you have time. So it helps you to identify what things to focus on and when to focus on them. And the key thing here, if you look at the logo on the top here, there's this juxtaposition of the two dark blue things, which is information management and security and compliance. And those two things, without those two things together, you can't have a defense in depth. Information management is really the protection of your data, the DR capabilities, and the archiving of your data. And then security and compliance, obviously, we've been talking about, which is the protection and reporting of how you're protecting. In order to be able to get to where I'm talking about, which is this aligning security and compliance on a budget, it's those things that I talked about really at the front of this, which is, number one, you have to lead with a compliance strategy. So by having a compliance-led strategy, you know at least what measures you're going to be doing and what your scorecard looks like. And then you do that defense in depth model and do a gap analysis between those two to close any gaps that you have in the environment. And then finally, by leveraging a managed security provider, you have the ability to implement, close those gaps in a much more cost-effective way than if you were to try to build them yourself. And that significantly helps you really increase your reach. So with that, I believe we are at the end, and I will open it up for questions. Yes?
You're talking about getting a security provider, but it seems like we have to have more than one. I mean, we already have one, we have others. It seems like it's not a one-stop shop. Is that,
so there's, that's a great question. There's a confusion between security providers and SOC providers. So for example, and I'm trying really hard not to be commercial here because we're not supposed to be commercial. We have a client that they were certain that the IT provider that they have, who promised they were handling all their security, took care of everything, and after they got hit with ransomware was when they said, we want to look at your SOC in addition to our current provider. So traditional managed service providers, and this is really IT as a service models, do all the patching and do the antivirus and do all the basics that we talked about in that core rung. Some of them do that next level, which was the ability to do log management and centralized logging and all that. Really what you don't get out of them is a full SOC, which is looking for threats. You get a monitoring, and it's more of a NOC or a TOC, Technical Operations Center, that's monitoring your environment, but they're looking for up-down incidents, they're looking for network outages, they're not looking for security incidents. So if you take it to the next level and go to the large-scale enterprises that have a lot to lose, their risk is much higher, they have multiple SOCs and they have multiple NOCs. And they operate differently, and in many cases they're not doing what I say, which is they should be working together in your tech ops and your sec ops, but you do need both types of organizations. Whether you outsource your IT or insource it, that's one side, but the same thing applies with your security, whether you outsource it or insource it. You need to have somebody who's looking at all the logs, and it might be the same logs that operations is looking at for disk space problems or CPU problems, but The security team is applying different rules to it. They're taking rules from threat databases that say if these things happen in this order, it's probably a threat and we need to escalate it for visibility. So the difference is really how you're looking at the same data. Did I answer your question before I move on? Yeah. Yes. Mm-hmm. So I can tell you every one of our clients has never paid, and we were able to recover them because of solid incident response. And incident response, as I said, requires the operational side. So if you don't have good backups and they're not tested, obviously you're in a place where what are you going to do? You have to pay it, otherwise you lose your data. So that alignment of tech ops and sec ops again is important to make sure you don't have to be bullied or into paying, but I don't have the stats globally. I didn't prepare those, but the reality is that in our customer base, we have not seen one of our customers that told us they were hit with ransomware and asked for help pay for it. Any other questions? Yes. Sure. Did everybody hear the question? So the question was asked that we talked about scorecards when we were on this slide, and the question is if you were to take, for example, a NIST framework and then rate yourself against that NIST framework, is that what we're talking about? That's definitely an approach that helps you to get to that gap analysis. Really the first place I would start though is that compliance led. So whatever regulatory controls that you have in place, and if you're using, for example, the cybersecurity framework as your regulatory controls, then start with that and use that as your baseline, and then do a risk assessment beyond that to see, okay, I've got these things covered. Now what happens if these key components in my environment are impacted? Am I covered with my controls or not? And that's really the next level up beyond. So first place is measure yourself against the regulatory control. The next place is, and if the regulatory control is the CIS type top 20, for example, that's 80 controls less than NIST CSF. So do you need to implement the other 60 controls or not? And the way you do that is that risk-based approach. So in some cases, CSF is too much for most organizations. Any other questions? I think we wrapped up a little early, so I'll give you 10 minutes back to your time. Thank you so much. And we have a booth out here, DataEndure, if you'd like to stop by for more information.